Hello, this is a presentation on Mark Bedau's Is Weak Emergence Just in the Mind for Philosophy 420. Um, let's start with some background on emergence. I got most of this information from Brian McLaughlin's article titled Emergence and Supervenience. So one of the first philosophers to discuss emergence, although he didn't actually use the term emergence or emergentism, was J.S. Mill. Um, he instead called it heteropathic. And he was applying this notion to science, chemistry in particular. He noticed that chemical reactions, sometimes there's a phenomena where on the macro level, you notice something that is not exactly the sum of its parts. It seems to be more than the sum of the parts. And he called this heteropathic. He believed that the laws of science change when parts combine to make a whole, and that the new laws supersede but do not contravene on the old laws. So basically, you have emergent laws that are not contradicting the old laws, but it's kind of inexplicable where they came from. And he called this heteropathic. And the next philosopher I have over here is George Henry Lewes, who coined the term emergent and contrasted it with resultant. Resultant is what you would expect to happen logically on the macro level when parts are combined. When the sum is not equal to the combination of the parts, that's when you have emergence. And Lloyd Morgan used the term evolution to describe emergent phenomena, and he contrasted this with mechanistic. It's the same idea that you have phenomena, behavior on the macro level, on the higher levels than what you see on the lower levels. And mechanistic mechanistic science can't explain it. It seems to be inexplicable, or at least it did to them, which is why they came up with this notion that there are things that are emergent, and it seems kind of mystical. We can't explain it scientifically, but it just kind of emerges. And of course, C.D. Broad is the last philosopher I have over here who wrote on this. He believed that nature is in a hierarchy, and at each level there is different emergent behavior. But he only believed in one substance. He didn't believe that there were different substances or emergent substances on each level. He believed in one fundamental substance. He also introduced the notion of transordinal laws, which seem to be new laws emergent from, but not deducible from, lower level orders. So you can't see these laws coming from the lower levels. They kind of emerge out of nowhere. And some problems for emergentism. Quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics offered a kind of alternative to what was going on at that time. Quantum mechanics was basically a reduction of different sciences, higher order sciences, to physics. And this seems to be consistent with reductive materialism, which is basically that everything is material. There is no emergent phenomena. There are no emergent phenomena. We can reduce all these seemingly inexplicable behaviors to some kind of science or another, and we can explain it. And they are deducible from the lower level. So it's kind of a bottom-up view of reality. McLaughlin seems to be a reductive materialist, although he's open to the question of whether consciousness is emergent. Jaegwon Kim is also a philosopher who is a reductive materialist, who kind of holds a deflationary view of emergence. And then there were the logical positivists of the 20th century, notably Carl Hempel. Also, Bertrand Russell was associated with this movement, A.J. Ayer. They believe strongly in verificationism. So if you can't verify it, they believe that it's not meaningful. As far as science goes, they had this theory of deductive and homological. Basically, they believe that most phenomena can be somehow deduced from other phenomena. Everything has to be worked out logically, and we don't need these kind of mystical concepts like emergence to enter the picture. Then came along David Chalmers, wrote an article called Strong and Weak Emergence. And this was kind of a response to the problems that we were seeing with emergence. So he defended what he called a dichotomy between strong and weak emergence. Basically, for Chalmers, strong emergence is an emergence that is not deducible from the lower level behaviors and patterns. And weak is deducible, but he believed that what separates them is that weak emergence are deducible but interesting and non-obvious. So, taking the ideal reasoner, you'd be able to deduce these phenomena from the lower level. Nevertheless, for most epistemic agents like human beings, it's not at all obvious what the emergent phenomena are going to be just based on the lower level. And for a strong emergence, he believed that there is just one case, just consciousness. That's the only case of strong emergence. There are some problems with this. It seems that interesting and non-obvious is an arbitrary way to define a concept, and this creates, the problem that it seems that it's just something that's in the mind, anthropocentric. It also puts emergentism at risk of collapsing into reductionism. That if we say that it's just in the mind, we can kind of deflate it and do away with it. We don't really need it. We could just say, well, these behaviors that we're calling emergent are just, we can just reduce them. We just don't need them. And along comes Mark Bedau, who wrote this article in 2008 defending weak emergence. His primary goal was to argue against the deflationary view that weak emergence is just in the mind. He responds to 3 basic objections. He also had some secondary goals to show how weak emergence is not just limited to computer simulations, but is also out there in the real world in natural systems, and also to show how weak emergence is never static and always dynamic. And Bedau gives us a formal definition of weak emergence. If P is a macro property of some system S, then P is weakly emergent if and only if P is generatively explainable from all of S's prior microfacts, but only in an incompressible way. So let's talk about compressibility. So I like to look at it as there being 2 kind of types of explanation. Compressible is an explanation of a macro behavior that no matter how far into the future the macro behavior goes or extends, we can cap the explanation. It's just a limited explanation. We don't need any causal historic process in order to do our explanation. An example of this is kind of a thought experiment from Bedau on page 446 of the article, which is a variant of Conway's game of life. He calls it all life. It's just one rule that if a cell has a neighbor that is dead or alive, the cell is alive no matter what. So we obviously know what's going to happen after a certain amount of generations. Every cell on the grid will be alive. We don't need a causal historic process. Arguably, we don't need that. We could just look at the one rule, and that's our explanation. Incompressibility, on the other hand, is an explanation that involves what he calls tracing the complex microcausal web. And the explanation is not capped or limited, so it can theoretically just keep going on. An example is Conway's game of life, and we'll look at an example of that from the actual game of life in a couple of slides. Bedau likens the explanatory process to crawling the microcausal web. I like to think about it as kind of a causal chain. Doesn't necessarily have to be linear, but that's why a web is probably a good word for it. It's basically just a complicated process involving, a whole lot of little interactions between local agents. And we can explain a pattern that emerges from these local levels by tracing the local microbehaviors. Any explanation that we do for a weak emergence will involve crawling the web. We can't get around that. That's what he means by incompressible. We just can't get around that. Bedau believed that weak emergence is reducible in principle. It's compatible with reductionism, this particular kind of emergence. But he also believed that an explanation is not possible without some kind of computer simulation. And he spoke about he discussed an example of a traffic jam, which he believes is an example of weak emergence. And obviously, there's not some kind of strange ontological thing that appears out of nowhere that has nothing to do with the stuff that came before it, which just kind of seems like consciousness. It's not. It's different than that. It's you can reduce it to just a bunch of cars. They happen to reach some critical point where traffic emerges, but it can, in theory, it can be reduced. But of course, you can't just give an explanation without actually going through some causal historic process. This is why he called it incompressible. You can't compress it into some simple explanation, some capped explanation. And there's a picture of Conway's game of life. It's a pattern that emerges from some initial conditions plus the rules that are built into the game. There are I think 3 or 4 rules about what determines if a cell will generate come into life or die or stay alive, and those basic rules plus some initial conditions will sometimes result in these patterns that Bedau believed are weakly emergent. So let's get some of the objections that Bedau is going to respond to. The first one is attributed to Silberstein and McGee. And obviously it's an objection that weak emergence is only in the mind. And they think that because it doesn't involve irreducible downward causation, that it's just in the mind. So they define, or they're kind of telling Bedau what is epistemological emergence, what is emergence that is just merely epistemological, that it's just in the mind and it's not really objective. So like I said, they think that it's an emergence that rejects irreducible downward causation. And Bedau admits that his definition of weak emergence does reject irreducible downward causation because, like I said before, weak emergence is reducible. It's compatible with reduction. And Bedau doesn't believe that there's some kind of mysterious downward causation going on that's not, well, he does believe that there is some kind of downward causation, but it is reducible in principle. And Bedau responds kind of just saying that they're not defining their terms correctly. I think that's kind of a weak response. I think he should have offered a little bit more. And to be fair to Silberstein and McGee, they're not just making some kind of linguistic mistake. I think they have a real objection there that if these things that we're calling weakly emergent, if they don't cause anything in the world, then how do we know they're there? Are we just making it up? And what's going on there? I think they have a legitimate concern. So I'll get to that a little bit later. And the second objection that he responds to, it's attributed to Hempel and Oppenheim, and they believe that weak emergence is only in the mind, because it's just apparent. It's not real. It just seems that way, and they attributed that apparent emergence to our science not being good enough to explain what's going on. So if we were a little bit more advanced scientifically, we'd be able to explain this. We wouldn't need these incompressible explanations. So in response to this objection, Bedau says that, well, look at the game of life. There's weakly emergent patterns coming out of nowhere, and we can't explain that in any compressible way. Yet we know everything that's going on in the game. We're not ignorant to any of the rules. The rules are pretty simple. We invented the game. Humans, a human being made it. We know exactly what's going on. It's not anything mysterious. So, that's an objection, and I think it's a good one. I think that kind of puts Hempel's worries to rest. So, objection number 3 is that emergence is anthropocentric. That its incompressibility is a human limitation. So an explanation is incompressible, and that's just our fault. It's because we can't compress it. I mean, I guess what the objection is saying is that these explanations that we're calling incompressible are compressible to some epistemic agent that we can maybe imagine, ideally. So Bedau is going to respond to this, saying that, incompressibility just is incompressibility. That's just what it is. It's not like it's incompressibility for us and compressible for, for some alien that's going to look at the situation and in some kind of different way. That's not what's going on. You simply there is no compressible way to look at this. You need to crawl the causal web to know what's going on. In a traffic jam, for instance, you can't predict it. It's not deducible with some short compressible explanation. You need these explanations that are not compressible, that are historic and crawling this web, in order to really see what's going on here and to explain it. So, this causal historic web is an objective feature of the system that we're talking about, and it has nothing to do with human epistemology. That just has nothing to do with it. Okay. And since Bedau spends a lot of time talking about computer simulations, he doesn't want anybody to get the wrong idea that weak emergence only happens in computers. No, so this happens everywhere. This happens in different kind of sciences and sociology, psychology, um, economics, different uh, natural systems display macro behaviors that are weakly emergent. He doesn't go into too many examples, but I'm assuming there are just a whole lot of them. Um, Here's a couple of them: traffic jams, vesicles, which are formations inside of cells. So he spoke about this a little bit, how there was some weak emergence going on over there. A lot of psychological theories are weakly emergent, he believed, and theories in sociology as well. But obviously, the computer plays a role in helping us understand emergence. If we have a simulation, that's our explanation. There is no for Bedau. If we're talking about weak emergence, there's no explanation that's going to go around that. There's no shortcut to explaining what's going on. We need that. We need that computer simulation. And he also mentioned that what's going on in the computer simulation is an emergence in itself. So it's not just a simulation of emergence, but in the game of life, that is a computer simulation. It's a computational program, and it is an example of weak emergence. So it doesn't have to be in the natural world. It can be something going on in a computer, and we can still say that that's an example of weak emergence. He also spoke about weak emergence being dynamic and never static. An example of static emergence would be strong emergence. So the kind of thing that's going on with the mental state and brain state. So you have a mental state that emerges from brain state, according to some theories, and but for Bedau, this has nothing to do with weak emergence. It's instantaneous, it's synchronic, and it's static. It just happens right away. It goes from brain state to mental state. There's no causal chain there, or if there is a causal chain, it's just one chain. We don't need any web crawling over there. On the other hand, weak emergence is always going to be dynamic. It's always going to be generated over time, and it's necessarily a causal historic process. So if we have a system, some kind of macro behavior, and we find ourselves needing to explain it in terms of a causal historic process. So Bedau is saying this is probably going to be something that's weakly emergent. And Bedau concludes that weak emergence is not just in a mind, not just in the mind. It's an objective feature of reality. He does this by responding to three counter arguments. And now I'm going to discuss some of my thoughts on Bedau's paper. So at one point, Bedau admits that incompressibility comes in degrees. So this kind of makes me feel like it's something that's kind of ambiguous. Or vague, I guess. Like at what point does it become incompressible? How much complexity does the system need? How big does the causal web need to be in order for us to say that this is incompressible? At one point does it go from being compressible to incompressible? That sounds kind of weird to me. And I don't know, it makes me doubt a little bit that our notion of incompressibility is, as good as it needs to be in order to make the Bedau's paper work. And also, if we do admit incompressibility, just take it for granted that it's there. Should we then say that there's something emerging, for instance, in a traffic pattern, is the traffic actually emergent? Do we need to say that? I question that. Maybe we don't need to, maybe we don't need that. Maybe we don't need to say that there's something going on here that's emergent that we need an explanation for. Um, so that's one of my thoughts on this. And also, are there things that meet Bedau's criteria for being weakly emergent that seem kind of odd to say that they're weakly emergent? An example, like how the Patriots won last Sunday. Obviously, they won by having more points, but how do they get those points, and how did the other team get less points? It seems like there is a causal web over there that we need to crawl. It doesn't seem like there's going to be some capped explanation. So this kind of seems to meet Bedau's criteria for being weakly emergent, yet it seems weird to say that one team winning a game is weakly emergent, or like Donald Trump winning the presidency is weakly emergent, because we need to go through some causal chain of all these different things that were happening in the country. But it kind of makes weak emergence a little bit trivial, in my opinion. Also, another problem for incompressibility is, how do we know when it's incompressible? When do we actually know this? It seems like we don't have a whole lot to tell us, like this is compressible, this is not compressible. For instance, think about a science experiment of like combining oil and water into a cup, and they don't mix, and they separate, and the oil goes on top because it has a lower density. So Bedau would probably say this is not an example of weak emergence, but how do we know that it's, or I'm sorry, he would say that it's not an example of something that needs an incompressible explanation. But how do we know that? Isn't there something going on there that is a causal web that isn't it in some way? Isn't it also incompressible? How do we know when the explanation is simply compressible? It's these. It seems there's some like this. It starts to sound a little bit arbitrary to me, and I think it would. I think some follow up would do if Bedau were to write another paper discussing these concepts a little bit more. I'd be interested to read that. Also, I think his response to Silberstein and McGee is a little bit weak. They brought up a legitimate concern. These phenomena are not actually causing anything irreducibly. So I think that Bedau should have answered in more of a affirmative way. I think maybe he could. He might have a reason not to do this, but if you think he doesn't have a reason to do this, please, let me know in your response. But maybe we can say that these weakly emergent phenomena are actually causing things in the world. For instance, like in economics, you have a recession. So that's something that's probably what Bedau would say is weakly emergent. And that has plenty of effects on plenty of people's lives. That's something that is real and objective, that we can actually see the effects of that. So I think that Bedau could have answered a little bit more in that kind of fashion, saying, okay, so you're right, there are these things that are emerging and they're objective, they're out there, and then we can see that because they have effects in the world. Anyway, thanks for listening.